The air was thick with smoke and fire. The sky above the battlefield was a deep red mixed with black clouds. The ground was broken and covered with the remains of a city that once stood tall. Now only metal ruins and shattered glass marked the place where thousands had lived. The human rescue ship moved slowly over the destruction, scanning for any sign of life. Its engines made a low hum as bright searchlights cut through the dust and darkness. Captain Mara stood at the front window of the bridge, her eyes locked on the scorched surface below. She was a tall woman with short dark hair and a voice that always carried strength. Yet today her heart felt heavy. She had seen many wars, but something about this place felt wrong. The destruction was too complete, too deliberate, as if someone wanted not just to win a battle, but to erase an entire people from existence. The sensors beeped, drawing her attention. One of the crew shouted that they had found a faint life sign, weak but still there. Without hesitation, Mara ordered the ship lower. The landing gear touched down on a cracked street, and the rescue team moved out, their boots crunching on debris, weapons ready in case of any hidden danger. The air outside was hot and dry. With a faint metallic taste, they passed broken walls and burned vehicles. The silence was unsettling. No animals, no wind, no voices, only the faint sound of the rescue team moving through the wreckage. Then they saw it. A small shadow crouched under a half-collapsed metal sheet. No movement at first, just two glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness. One of the soldiers moved closer, speaking in a calm voice. The shadow shifted, and they saw her. A small alien girl, no more than 7 years old. Her skin a pale silver with faint blue lines running like veins across her arms. Her hair dark and tangled. Her clothes torn and burned in places. She held a small piece of twisted metal like it was a weapon. Her eyes locked on the humans with a mix of fear and determination. Mara stepped forward, slowly kneeling to meet her gaze. She said words the girl could not understand. Her voice gentle but firm. The girl did not move. Her grip on the metal piece tightened. Behind Mara, the crew exchanged uneasy looks. They had seen frightened children before, but this was different. There was no crying, no pleading, only silence and eyes that studied every detail as if memorizing escape routes and weaknesses. Mara reached into her belt pouch and pulled out a small packet of water. She placed it on the ground between them. The girl's eyes darted to it, but she did not move. Mara then stepped back, giving her space. After a long pause, the girl crawled forward, snatched the water, and drank quickly, her hands trembling yet her eyes never leaving Mara's face. When the packet was empty, she let it drop and sat still again, almost as if waiting for what would happen next. The crew looked at Mara, waiting for her decision. Protocol said they should report the find and wait for orders, but Mara knew what the orders would be. They would say, leave her. The mission was to recover human survivors only, but something deep inside Mara refused to accept that. She told the crew they were bringing the girl aboard. No one argued, though some shifted uncomfortably. They could all feel the weight of this choice. Back on the ship, the girl was given a small room, clean clothes, and more water. She accepted them without a word. She did not speak their language and did not seem to trust anyone. She sat on the bed with her knees drawn up, watching the door, her eyes following every person who passed. Mara came to check on her later and tried again to speak, but the girl only tilted her head slightly, as if listening but not answering. That night the ship drifted silently through space on its way back to human territory. The crew was tired. Some were sleeping. Some were in the mess hall. Mara was on the bridge reviewing reports when an alarm sounded. It was not loud, but sharp enough to make her stand instantly. One of the guards called over the comm. The girl was missing from her room. Mara moved quickly down the narrow corridors, her boots striking the floor in a steady rhythm. The crew spread out to search, checking storage rooms and maintenance tunnels. Then one voice crackled over the comm. They had found her in the weapons storage room, crouched beside a crate, her small hands tracing the outlines of a rifle as if she had seen one before. She looked up as Mara entered, her expression calm, almost too calm for a child in such a place. Mara knelt beside her again, speaking softly. The girl did not pull away this time. Instead, she pointed at the rifle, then at herself, her gesture slow and deliberate. Mara understood the meaning even without words. This child knew weapons, and maybe she knew how to use them. It sent a chill through her. Questions swirled in her mind. Who was this girl? How had she survived here alone? And why did she seem more soldier than child? The next day, they continued their journey back to Earth. Mara stayed near the girl as often as she could, bringing her food, showing her simple things like how to open a storage drawer or use the cleaning sink. Slowly, the girl began to watch her with less suspicion. Though she still did not speak, the crew gave her space, but they all felt the same strange energy around her, a quiet intensity that made it hard to look away. When they finally arrived on Earth, Mara carried the girl down the ramp herself. The city lights glowed in the distance, and for a moment the girl's eyes widened, taking in the strange beauty. This would be her new home, though neither she nor Mara could yet know the path ahead, a path that would lead from quiet rooms and gentle care to battlefields across the stars, a path that would turn a silent orphan into the most feared mercenary alive. And as the night settled over the human city, Mara could not shake the image of those glowing eyes staring from the wreckage. Not in fear, but in calculation. She knew then that this was no ordinary child, and that the decision she made on that broken world had set events in motion that would shake the galaxy itself. The girl was given a name by Captain Mara, who decided that she could not remain a nameless shadow in the corridors of the human ship. So she called her Lyra, a name simple and short, easy for the tongue, and soft for the ear. Though the girl never smiled when it was spoken, she still looked up whenever she heard it, as if slowly claiming it as her own. Earth was a world of green hills, wide oceans, and skies free from the ash clouds that had hung over the ruins where Lyra was found. The air here was warm and clean, and the smell of growing plants filled every breath. Yet even in this peace, Lyra's eyes moved constantly, scanning streets, buildings, and people the way a hunter might study a forest for hidden movement. Mara took her to a small home in the city's outer district where the sound of passing air cars mixed with the laughter of children playing in the yards. The house was quiet and filled with soft light from tall windows, a place far removed from the metal corridors of the ship. Mara showed Lyra where she would sleep, a bed with a blanket colored in deep blue. The girl touched it with careful fingers as if unsure if it was real, then sat on the edge watching the door. Days turned into weeks, and while the city outside moved with the easy rhythm of normal life, inside the home Lyra kept her silence. She listened to Mara speak, repeating words slowly so that the girl could learn the human tongue. At first, Lyra only tilted her head, but over time her lips began to form the shapes of the words she heard. She learned names for things: cup, table, water, bread, window, sky. She spoke rarely, but each word was clear and exact. Mara tried to bring moments of joy into the girl's days. She took her to markets filled with bright colors and strange smells, to parks where tall trees reached into the clouds, and to the coast where waves crashed against dark rocks. Lyra walked beside her without fear, but also without the restless energy of other children. She moved with quiet control, her eyes always studying details, the way people held their hands, the way doors opened, the way footsteps sounded on different ground. One afternoon, while Mara was cooking in the kitchen, she heard a sound from the small yard behind the house. Stepping outside, she found Lyra standing still with a wooden stick in her hands, moving it through the air in sharp, precise patterns. The motion was not random. It was practiced like drills from some long-forgotten training. Mara stood there watching, realizing that the girl's past life had not been ordinary. Whatever world she came from had prepared her for something more dangerous than playing with toys. Years passed, and the bond between them grew strong. Lyra began to laugh, sometimes a quiet, almost shy laugh that came when Mara told her small stories about old space voyages or strange markets she had seen. She learned to cook simple meals and to fix small machines around the house. She attended a human school for a short time, but her quiet nature and strange focus made her different from the other children, so Mara arranged private lessons instead. Lyra's body grew taller, stronger, and faster than most human girls her age. She could climb walls, leap fences, and run for long distances without tiring. Mara decided to teach her formal self-defense, hoping to give her a safe outlet for her energy. She was surprised to find that Lyra already knew many moves, blocking strikes and breaking holds with a skill that seemed far too advanced for someone so young. When Mara asked where she learned, Lyra only shrugged. On Lyra's 16th birthday, Mara gave her a small metal pendant shaped like a star. She told her it was a symbol of home, and belonging something to remind her that she was not alone. Lyra took it without a smile, but she kept it around her neck. From that day forward, it became the only piece of jewelry she ever wore. That night, as the city lights shimmered in the distance, and the air carried the faint scent of rain, Mara and Lyra sat together in the living room when the sound of distant thunder rolled across the sky. Except it was not thunder. The deep hum of engines came from above. Windows rattled as a dark shadow passed over the house. Mara stepped outside and looked up into the clouds. A large alien ship descended slowly, its hull black and marked with glowing red lines. Its shape was sharp like the blade of a weapon. It hovered in the air for a moment before beams of light cut down toward the ground, scanning the streets around them. The comm device on Mara's wrist came to life with a sharp voice from Central Command ordering her to stay inside and keep her ward hidden. They knew the ship was searching, but they did not yet know for what or for whom. Mara's stomach turned as she looked back at Lyra. The girl stood in the doorway, staring at the ship with an expression Mara had never seen before. It was not fear, it was recognition. The ship's beams moved closer, sweeping across rooftops and alleyways. The hum of its engines grew louder, shaking the walls of the house. Lyra stepped forward as if drawn to the sound. Mara grabbed her arm, but the girl's eyes were fixed upward, her body tense like a predator before a strike. The beams stopped suddenly on their street, flooding the yard in white light. A voice echoed from the ship in a language Mara did not know, but Lyra seemed to understand. Her eyes narrowed, and she clenched her fists. Mara pulled her back into the house, sealing the door and activating the security locks outside. Heavy footsteps landed on the ground, armored figures emerging from the light, carrying weapons. They moved with perfect coordination, surrounding the house. The first impact against the door came like a hammer strike, shaking the frame. Mara shouted for Lyra to get behind her, but instead the girl moved toward the kitchen, grabbing a long metal rod from the tool rack. When the door burst open, the armored soldiers stepped inside, their weapons raised. Before Mara could react, Lyra was already moving. She struck the first soldier across the helmet, sending him crashing into the wall. Then she spun low, sweeping the legs of another. Her speed was unreal, her movements precise and deadly. The soldiers hesitated, as if unsure how to handle a target so small, yet so dangerous. One of them shouted something again, that strange language, and Lyra's face twisted in anger. She disarmed another soldier, taking his weapon and turning it on him, firing bursts of energy that sent him to the floor. The others began to retreat, pulling back toward the ship. Lyra chased them to the yard, firing again, until the last one was gone. The black ship lifted into the sky, disappearing into the clouds as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only scorch marks on the ground. Mara stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. She had seen soldiers trained for years who could not move with such precision and control, yet Lyra had done it without hesitation, without fear. She lowered the weapon slowly, her breathing steady, her eyes still watching the sky, as if expecting the ship to return. Mara stepped toward her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Lyra looked at her, then at the weapon in her hand, and finally let it fall to the ground. That night the house was quiet, but neither of them slept. Mara sat in the kitchen, replaying the fight in her mind, wondering who those soldiers were and why they had come for Lyra, and most of all, what kind of child she had raised under her roof for all these years. The sun rose over the city, casting pale light across the quiet streets, but in Mara's home the air was heavy with unspoken fear. The attack from the night before still echoed in their minds. Lyra sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She did not drink, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the street, as if expecting armored soldiers to appear again. Mara moved around the kitchen, her voice calm, but her steps quick as she prepared for what she knew was coming, because ships like the one they saw did not come without reason, and enemies like that did not simply leave. By midday, the local security force had surrounded the neighborhood, scanning every vehicle, and pedestrian drones hovered above the rooftops, scanning for signs of alien tech. Mara answered their questions, carefully hiding the truth of what Lyra had done the night before, but it was clear from the way the soldiers looked at her home that the truth was not far from being uncovered. Lyra spent the afternoon in the small yard, practicing with the metal rod from the kitchen, each strike and movement sharp, controlled, and silent. She moved like someone who had trained for years, As if each motion was burned into her memory, Mara watched her from the doorway, torn between pride and fear, because she knew that such skill did not belong to a normal child, and now the people who had given her that skill were hunting her again. That night the sound came again, a deep hum in the distance, growing louder. With every passing second the black ship returned its shadow, sweeping over the rooftops this time. It did not hover, instead smaller craft, detached from its belly, gliding through the air. Like black arrows they landed silently on nearby rooftops, armored figures leaping down to the streets, surrounding the block. Mara grabbed her rifle from the wall and signaled for Lyra to stay close. But Lyra shook her head and moved toward the door, her eyes cold and focused. The first squad moved through the front gate, their weapons raised. They spoke in that same strange language, the one Lyra understood, but Mara did not. The leader stepped forward, shouting something that made Lyra's jaw tighten. Mara could see it in her eyes. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to take her by force and maybe to kill anyone who stood in the way. The moment the leader raised his weapon, Lyra moved. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, striking the barrel aside with the metal rod and driving her knee into his chest. The force sent him crashing back into his squad. The others opened fire, bolts of energy cutting through the air. Mara dropped to cover, returning fire from behind the doorway, but Lyra was already among them, her movements a blur, each strike disabling a weapon or breaking a limb. She fought with precision, not wasting a single motion, her focus absolute. One soldier lunged at her from behind, but she spun low, sweeping his legs and smashing the rod into his helmet. The crack echoed through the street. He did not get up. Mara could barely keep up with the chaos, her rifle dropping enemy after enemy. But Lyra's speed was something else. She seemed to know exactly where each soldier would be before they moved, as if reading their thoughts. Then it happened. A soldier cornered her, his weapon raised point blank, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Lyra twisted her body, grabbing his arm and forcing the weapon up. The blast tore through the air, missing her, but burning across his own armor. She wrenched the weapon from his hands, turned it, and fired without hesitation. The soldier fell instantly, his armor smoking, the smell of burned metal and flesh mixing in the air. Mara froze for a second. She had seen Lyra fight before, but never kill. Now there was no going back. The girl had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, but Lyra did not falter. She stepped over the fallen soldier and continued fighting, driving the rest of the squad back toward the street. The black ship above shifted its position as if preparing for another move. Suddenly, a loud mechanical roar filled the air. A larger figure dropped from the ship, its armor thicker, its weapon heavier than the others. This was no common soldier. This was an elite hunter sent to capture dangerous targets. It towered over Lyra, but she did not step back. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the stolen rifle and advanced. The hunter swung its massive weapon, forcing her to leap aside. The blow cracked the pavement where she had stood. Mara fired at the hunter from the side, but its armor absorbed the shots. It turned toward her, raising its weapon. Lyra seized the chance. She sprinted forward, sliding under its arm and driving the rifle upward into the gap beneath its chest plate. The blast tore through the armor, and the hunter staggered. Lyra climbed onto its back, ripping away part of the armor and firing again. This time the creature fell to its knees and then collapsed completely. The street was silent for a moment, except for the hum of the ship above. Then the remaining soldiers retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The black ship lifted high into the clouds, disappearing as quickly as it had come, leaving only bodies, smoke, and the heavy weight of what had happened. Mara stepped into the yard, her eyes fixed on Lyra, who stood in the center, breathing hard, her hands still gripping the rifle. There was no fear in her face, only calm, and something deeper, a quiet certainty, as if she had always known this day would come. Mara approached slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Lyra glanced at her, then at the fallen soldiers, her voice low, and even she said one word in her own language, a word Mara did not know, but from the way it sounded, she guessed it meant finished or maybe beginning. The security forces arrived minutes later, their armored vehicles rumbling down the street. The commander took one look at the scene and ordered the area sealed off, but Mara knew that once the bodies were examined, once the weapons were traced, the truth would spread through every channel and across every world. The Empire had sent killers after Lyra and failed. Now they would come in greater numbers and with greater force. That night, Mara sat across from Lyra in the dim light of the kitchen, the rifle lying between them. She wanted to ask 100 questions, but the girl simply stared at the weapon, her fingers running along its surface, as if remembering every detail of the fight. Finally, Mara spoke, telling her that staying here was no longer safe. The soldiers would return, and next time, they might not come only for her, but for anyone connected to her. Lyra nodded once, not in fear, but in agreement. She understood perfectly what must be done. Before dawn, they packed only what they could carry: weapons, food, a few changes of clothes. Mara placed the star-shaped pendant back around Lyra's neck, telling her to keep it close no matter what. They left the house quietly, the city still asleep behind them, heading toward the spaceport, where Mara had old contacts who could arrange passage off-world. As they walked through the silent streets, Mara realized that the girl she had raised was no longer just her daughter. She was something far more dangerous and far more important to the fate of more than one world. And somewhere deep in the cold dark of space, the empire that had destroyed Lyra's people and tried to erase her from existence was already preparing for the next hunt. The sky over the city was dark with clouds when Mara and Lyra reached the edge of the spaceport. The air smelled of rain and burning fuel from the ships that rose into the sky like silver arrows disappearing into the night. The port was alive with noise, workers shouting over the roar of engines, cargo droids moving heavy crates, traders haggling with pilots about the cost of passage, and the constant low hum of energy shields that guarded the landing bays. Mara kept her hood low and her eyes scanning the crowd. Every shadow seemed dangerous now, every face a possible threat. They moved toward a narrow hangar near the far wall, where old ships sat in silence, guarded by a single man with a long coat and tired eyes. Mara knew him. His name was Kalen, an old friend from her mercenary days. He had once saved her life on a mission gone wrong and owed her more than one favor. He looked at her with surprise and something like worry in his eyes, but said nothing until she and Lyra were inside the hangar, away from the noise and light. Kalen asked who the girl was and why. Mara looked like she had been through a war. Mara told him they needed a ship. Now, no questions, no delays. She said it had to be unregistered and it had to leave before sunrise. Kalen frowned, saying that kind of ship and that kind of timing would cost more than she could pay. But when she told him who was chasing them and what had happened in the city, his face went pale, and he agreed without another word. He said there was one vessel ready to fly, an old freighter named the Iron Wind. Its captain was a man called Derek, known for taking dangerous jobs if the pay was right. They found Derek near the loading ramp of his ship, talking to two of his crew. He was tall, with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too many battles. His voice was low and calm, but carried the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed. He listened to Mara's request and studied Lyra for a long moment before nodding. He said he could take them, but once they were aboard, there was no turning back, and whatever trouble they brought would become his trouble. Mara agreed, and the deal was made. Lyra followed Mara up the ramp, her eyes scanning the interior of the ship. The Iron Wind smelled of metal, oil, and faint traces of ozone from the shield generators. The walls were covered with patched panels and old wiring, the kind of ship that had been repaired more times than it had been cleaned. But the engines hummed with quiet strength, and the crew moved with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. As the ship prepared for departure, Lyra sat in the cargo bay, watching crates being secured by magnetic clamps. She kept her hand near the small pistol Mara had given her earlier, her ears catching every sound from the engines to the soft click of boots on the metal floor. She noticed how the crew avoided looking at her directly, as if they sensed something dangerous about her, but could not name it. When the Iron Wind lifted from the ground, the entire ship shuddered, then steadied as it rose through the heavy clouds, breaking into the clear night sky. Below them, the lights of the city faded into darkness, and ahead of them the stars stretched endlessly. Mara stood beside Lyra, watching the view, saying quietly that once they left the planet, there would be no safe place to return to. They were now part of something larger and far more dangerous than before. 2 hours into the flight, Derek came to the cargo bay carrying a data pad. He said they had picked up a faint signal trailing them, a shadow moving just beyond the edge of their sensors. Mara's eyes narrowed, knowing it had to be an enemy scout sent by the same people who had attacked them on Earth. Derek said they would have to change course, heading into a less traveled sector of space to lose them, but that would take them near the edge of the frontier, a place full of raiders, smugglers, and Mercenaries with no loyalty except to credits, Mara said. It was better than being caught by the ones chasing them, Derek agreed, but warned that survival out there required strength and skill, and he was not in the habit of protecting passengers. Lyra listened without speaking, but in her mind she had already made a choice. She would not be just a passenger. She would fight, if needed, and she would not hide behind others when danger came her way. The next day, the ship entered the frontier sector. The stars here seemed colder and sharper against the black. The planets they passed were dark and barren, with only scattered lights from mining stations or outlaw bases. Derek ordered the crew to keep weapons ready and shields on full power. They were still tracking the faint signal on the edge of their sensors, but it was keeping its distance. Late that night, while most of the crew slept, a distress signal came through, faint and broken. It was coming from a small transport drifting without power. Derek hesitated, knowing it could be a trap, but Mara said they should investigate. The Iron Wind approached the transport slowly, weapons armed ready for anything. As they drew close, they saw scorch marks along its hull and no signs of life support. Derek sent a boarding team. Mara insisted on joining, and to his surprise, Lyra followed without hesitation. The air inside the transport was cold and thin, their breath misting in the dim light. They moved through narrow corridors, finding signs of a fight, blaster burns along the walls, blood smeared on the floor, but no bodies. The ship's log was damaged, but the last entry spoke of an attack by unknown raiders and cargo stolen before the crew disappeared. In the cargo hold, they found one survivor, a young man, barely conscious, with a deep wound in his side. Lyra knelt beside him, pressing her hands over the wound to slow the bleeding, while Mara called for a med kit. The man opened his eyes and whispered something about the raiders returning before losing consciousness. They carried him back to the Iron Wind, where the medic worked quickly to save his life. Not long after they returned, the sensors lit up with multiple incoming ships. Fast and armed, the raiders had followed the transport's distress signal, hoping to catch whoever answered it. Derek ordered the crew to battle stations, and the Iron Wind's weapons roared to life. The first enemy ship exploded in a flash of fire and debris, but the others kept coming, moving like wolves around a wounded prey. Mara manned one of the turrets, her shots tearing through the enemy shields. Lyra strapped herself into the second turret despite Derek shouting at her to stay out of the fight. She ignored him, focusing on the targeting system. Her first shots missed, but she adjusted quickly, hitting an enemy ship square in the engines, sending it spiraling into another ship. The explosion lit up the dark space like a small sun. The battle was short but brutal. When it was over, 3 enemy ships drifted in pieces, and the rest fled into the void. The Iron Wind had taken damage, but nothing the crew could not repair. Derek looked at Lyra with a mix of anger and respect, telling her she had no right to be that good with a turret on her first try. Lyra only shrugged, saying she had learned fast because she had to. As they left the wreckage behind, Mara knew this was only the beginning. Lyra was stepping into the life of a fighter, and every battle would make her stronger, but also harder. She wondered how long it would be before the girl stopped being her daughter and became something the galaxy would fear. The Iron Wind drifted in the quiet stretch of space where no trade routes passed and no patrol ships bothered to scan the shadows. The crew was repairing the damage from the battle with the raiders, while Derek met with Mara in the war room. The walls here were lined with old maps and star charts glowing in soft blue light. Derek placed a small encrypted device on the table and slid it toward Mara, saying it contained a message from an old contact who was looking for people willing to take a dangerous job. Mara asked how dangerous. Derek replied that the pay was high enough to make anyone forget the risks. Lyra was outside the room, listening, her back pressed against the cold wall. She heard the words dangerous job, and her heart quickened. She wanted to fight. She wanted to prove she was more than just someone who had to be protected. When Mara stepped out, she caught Lyra's gaze and said there was work ahead, but it was not the kind of work for someone still learning to survive. Lyra argued, saying she had already fought in one battle and saved lives, but Mara shook her head, saying one fight did not make a mercenary. The message described a colony on the edge of the frontier under attack from a group of ex-military deserters turned pirates. They had taken hostages and blocked all communication. The local government had no forces to send, so they were offering a reward for any crew willing to remove the threat. Derek wanted the job because the payment was enough to repair the Iron Wind and keep it running for another year. Mara was not sure, but when Lyra stepped forward and said they could not leave those people To die, she saw the fire in her eyes and agreed, on one condition: Lyra would follow every order without question. The journey to the colony took 2 days, during which Lyra trained with the crew, learning how to move through narrow corridors with a rifle, how to reload under pressure, and how to keep her breathing steady when aiming. Mara watched from the side, correcting her stance or telling her to keep her elbows, and Lyra learned faster movements, growing sharper with each drill. She began to understand that fighting was more than just pulling a trigger. It was reading the field, knowing when to advance and when to fall back. When they reached the colony, they found it dark, the surface dotted with the faint glow of emergency lights. The main settlement was surrounded by a ring of makeshift barricades and gun emplacements. The pirates had turned the place into a fortress. Derek studied the layout on the ship's sensors, noting the weak points. While Mara planned their entry, she decided they would land on the far side of the settlement under cover of night and move in on foot, using the shadows to stay hidden. Lyra was given a small rifle and told to stay close. The landing was silent, the iron wind touching down on a rocky ridge beyond the colony. The crew moved quickly down the ramp, their boots crunching on the thin layer of dust covering the ground. The air was cold and thin, making every breath feel heavier. In the distance, faint lights marked the edge of the settlement. Mara led the way, moving from rock to rock, using the terrain as cover. Lyra followed, matching her steps, her eyes scanning for movement. They reached the outer wall, where 2 pirate guards stood talking near a makeshift gate. Mara signaled for silence, then pointed to Derek, who moved around to flank them. Lyra watched as Derek came up behind the guards, knocking one unconscious with a quick strike and catching the other in a chokehold until he dropped. Mara gestured for Lyra to follow as they slipped through the gate into the heart of the settlement. Inside, they found the place in ruined market stalls, overturned buildings, scorched from blaster fire. The few colonists they saw were huddled in corners, fear in their eyes. Mara asked one woman where the hostages were kept. The woman pointed toward a large storage building near the center, guarded by at least 6 pirates. Mara whispered the plan: Derek and 2 crew members would create a distraction on the far side, while she and Lyra slipped into the building from the rear. The distraction came fast. A loud explosion shook the ground and shouts filled the air. The guards rushed toward the noise, leaving the rear entrance unguarded. Mara moved in first, Lyra close behind. Inside, the building was dark and smelled of sweat and fear. The hostages were tied together in the center, their eyes wide with hope and disbelief when they saw armed rescuers. Mara told them to stay quiet as she began cutting their restraints. A voice came from the shadows telling her to stop. A tall man stepped forward, wearing old military armor with pirate insignia scratched across the chest. He held a blaster in one hand and a knife in the other. Lyra recognized him as the leader from the description in the message. His name was Varric, known for killing anyone who challenged him. Mara stepped between him and the hostages, her rifle aimed steady, but Varric only smiled, saying she was outnumbered. Before she could answer, 3 more pirates stepped out from behind the crates. Lyra's heart pounded, but she remembered her training. She slid to the side, finding cover behind a stack of metal barrels. From there, she aimed and fired, hitting one pirate in the shoulder. The sudden attack broke their focus. Mara used the moment to drop another with a shot to the leg. Varric lunged forward, but Mara met him with a hard strike from her rifle stock, sending him reeling. Lyra moved fast, firing again and forcing the remaining pirates to dive for cover. The fight was fast and brutal, the room filled with shouts and the crack of blaster fire. Mara knocked Varric to the ground and pressed her weapon to his chest, telling him to call off his men. He spat blood and laughed, saying they would never stop. But when Lyra stepped forward, her eyes cold and unflinching, he hesitated. Something in her stare made even a man like him pause. He gave the order, and the pirates lowered their weapons. With the hostages freed, they moved quickly back to the ship. Derek covering their retreat. The pirates did not follow, perhaps unwilling to test their luck again. Once aboard the Iron Wind, the crew tended to the wounded, while Mara sat with Lyra in the quiet corner. She told her she had done well, but warned that every fight like this took something from a person, and it was important to remember why they fought. Lyra said she fought for the people who could not fight for themselves. Mara nodded, but in her heart she knew there was more to it. The girl was changing, becoming sharper, faster, more dangerous. As the Iron Wind left the colony behind, Lyra stood at the viewport, watching the stars drift by She thought about Varric's eyes when he realized she was not afraid. She thought about the way the hostages had looked at her with gratitude and fear, and she wondered what she would become if she kept living like this. Word of the Iron Wind's victory at the colony spread fast across the frontier, traveling on the voices of traders, smugglers, and frightened pirates who spoke of a young girl with cold eyes who could stand beside the deadliest mercenaries without fear. Some called her the Orphan from Earth, others said she was the human shadow that came before death. And though many doubted the stories, there were those who listened with interest and began to ask questions. Lyra did not know that her name was being whispered in spaceports and black market halls. She was on the ship training with Mara every day, learning new ways to fight and survive. Mara was harder on her now, pushing her past the point of exhaustion, making her reload until her fingers bled, making her run combat drills until her arms shook from holding the rifle steady. Lyra did not complain. She wanted to be better. She wanted to make sure no one could ever take away the people she cared about again. One evening, while the ship drifted near an asteroid field, Derek called Mara to the war room, his face grim. He had intercepted a coded transmission mentioning Lyra's description. The message came from a group known as the Ash Vultures, a crew of assassins who took contracts that no one else dared to touch. Mara asked what the contract was. Derek only said the bounty was high enough to make half the outer rim come looking. Mara glanced at Lyra, who stood in the doorway, and told her to sit down because they had to talk. Mara explained that the Ash Vultures were not like the pirates they had fought before. They were trained killers who hunted in packs and never gave up until their target was dead. Lyra listened without fear, but she felt something deep in her stomach, a heavy cold weight. Mara told her they could change their route, avoid major ports, keep to the deep black until the bounty cooled. But Lyra shook her head, saying running would only make them look weak and invite more hunters. Mara studied her face for a long moment, then said if they stayed, they had to be ready to fight, not just one battle, but many. The Iron Wind's next job took them to a mining station on the edge of a red dwarf system. The crew was hired to escort a shipment of refined or to a trade hub, but Mara suspected the Vultures might use the trip as an ambush. She had the crew double the watch shifts and keep weapons ready. Lyra was assigned to the forward observation post, a small bubble of glass and steel jutting from the ship's hull. From there, she could see the stars in every direction and the faint shimmer of the asteroid belt they were leaving behind. Hours passed in silence until Lyra noticed a flicker in the dark, a shadow that moved against the stars too fast to be natural. She tapped the comm to alert Mara. Just as the ship's sensors lit up with incoming contacts, 3 small attack craft moving in fast. Derek swung the ship into a sharp roll. As the first shot streaked past the hull, the Iron Wind's guns came alive, spitting fire into the dark. 2 of the attackers dodged wide, but the third pressed closer. Mara ordered Lyra to the gun deck, where she strapped into a turret, her hands moving with the speed Mara had drilled into her. She tracked the nearest target and squeezed the trigger. The blast tore across the enemy ship's wing, forcing it to break off. The crew cheered, but Mara's voice cut through, telling them to focus because more were coming. The Vultures had sent a full wing, and their ships were faster than anything the Iron Wind could outfly. The fight raged for long minutes, the Iron Wind weaving through enemy fire. Lyra scored 2 more hits, one sending a Vulture craft spinning into the void, the other crippling its engines. But the ship shook under the impact of return fire. Alarms blared as one of the port thrusters went offline. Mara ordered Derek to head for a nearby moon, its jagged surface offering a chance to lose their pursuers. The Vultures followed, but the Iron Wind dove low, skimming the craters and ridges until the enemy ships risked collision and broke formation. They landed in a deep canyon hidden from orbital scans. The crew worked to repair the damage, while Mara paced the deck, thinking the Vultures would not give up. They would wait in the system until the Iron Wind tried to leave. Lyra stood by her rifle, looking out at the red dust blowing across the canyon floor. She asked why they would chase her this hard. Mara said it was not just about the bounty. Sometimes hunters wanted to break the ones who were starting to look dangerous. That night, as the crew rested, Lyra could not sleep. She thought about the eyes of the Vulture pilots. When she had shot them down, she thought about how her heart had not raced in fear, but in something else, something sharper. She walked the canyon floor in the thin air, listening to the wind and the faint hum of the ship behind her, and she wondered if the Vultures were out there watching, waiting for her to step into the open. The next morning, Derek reported that a distress signal was coming from a nearby outpost. Mara suspected it was a trap, but Lyra argued they should check, saying if it was real, they could not ignore it. Mara reluctantly agreed, sending a small team, including Lyra, in a shuttle. The outpost sat on the rim of a massive crater, its walls scorched and gates hanging open. They entered cautiously, finding signs of a fight, but no bodies. The air inside was still and heavy, the silence pressing against their ears. They split into pairs, searching the corridors. Lyra moved with one of the older crew members named Harlan, who kept glancing over his shoulder as if he could feel something stalking them. They reached the control room and found it empty, except for a blinking console. Lyra approached and saw the words "playback active." She hit the key, and the screen lit with the image of a masked figure who spoke in a calm, cold voice, saying they had come for the girl, and the crew of the Iron Wind had one chance to hand her over before the vultures tore the ship apart. Before Lyra could respond, the lights in the room went out. A sharp hiss filled the air, and the windows shattered inward. Harlan shouted for cover as shapes dropped from above, armored figures with black visors and the insignia of the vultures. Lyra rolled behind a console, firing upward, hitting one in the chest, but the armor held. She aimed for the joints as Mara had taught her, and the figure fell. Another rushed forward, swinging a blade that scraped across her shoulder. She felt the pain, but kept moving, driving her knee into the attacker's stomach and wrenching the weapon away. The fight was chaos, blaster bolts sparking off walls, shouts echoing in the dark. Lyra moved like a shadow, slipping between enemies and striking with precision. The training that had been hammered into her bones came alive in every step, every shot. When the last of the vultures fell, she stood over them, breathing hard. Harlan looked at her with a mix of shock and respect, saying he had never seen anyone move like that. Lyra just picked up her rifle, and so they needed to get back before more came. They returned to the Iron Wind with the warning clear. The vultures were not going to stop, and the next fight would be even worse. Mara met Lyra at the ramp and told her she had done well, but every time she survived, it would make the hunters more desperate. Lyra nodded, feeling the truth of those words, but she also felt something else deep inside, a quiet certainty that she was no longer just surviving. She was becoming something the vultures could never break. The Iron Wind drifted beyond the edge of the red dwarf system, hiding among fractured rocks that spun slowly in the black, while the crew worked in silence, repairing what damage they could from the last fight. The air on board felt heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next attack. Mara stayed in the war room, her eyes locked on the star map, where the Ash Vulture's ships were still marked on the edge of their sensors, waiting like wolves in the snow. Derek muttered that they would not leave until they had what they came for, and that meant sooner or later the Iron Wind would have to make a move. Lyra sat in the corner of the room, cleaning her rifle, the metal gleaming under the pale light. She had not slept much since the ambush at the outpost. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the masked faces of the vultures falling in the dark, and she could hear their leader's voice promising to take her. She felt no fear, only a strange calm, as if she knew that everything had been building toward this moment. Mara watched her for a while before speaking, saying that there was no running anymore. If they broke through now, the vultures would follow, but if they waited, the hunters would tighten their net until escape was impossible. Lyra said, then they had to turn the hunt around and end it here. The plan was simple in shape, but sharp in execution. The Iron Wind would send out a false distress call, disguised as a freighter crippled by pirates. The signal would draw the vultures in close, thinking they had an easy prize. Once they were within striking range, the Iron Wind would spring from hiding, using the asteroid for cover, and tear into them before they could regroup. It was risky, but Mara agreed, because waiting meant certain death. Derek began feeding false data into the beacon, while the crew loaded every weapon they had. Hours later, the sensors pinged the vultures had taken the bait: 4 attack craft and 1 heavy command ship moving in tight formation. Lyra stood ready on the gun deck, her hand steady as she watched them approach. Mara's voice came over the comm, telling all stations to hold fire until she gave the word. The asteroids loomed like silent mountains around them, the Iron Wind's engines barely humming in the void when the first vulture craft passed within range. Mara gave the signal, and the darkness lit with fire. The opening volley ripped through the lead craft, tearing it apart before it could turn. The others scattered, but the Iron Wind was already moving, sliding between rocks and spitting death from its turrets. Lyra tracked one fighter weaving through debris, and caught it with a burst that split its hull. The explosion flashed bright, then vanished into the black derrick, pushed the ship toward the command vessel, knowing if they cut off the head the body would falter. But the vultures were disciplined. They formed a wall of steel and fire, forcing the iron wind to fight for every meter. Inside the gun deck, Lyra felt the ship shake under heavy hits. Alarm screamed, but she kept her eyes on the targeting scope. One of the enemy fighters tried to flank them. She swung the turret hard and fired the shot, clipped its wings, sending it spinning into an asteroid. The debris burst apart, showering the void with glowing fragments. Mara ordered the forward cannons to focus on the command ship, and the iron wind surged ahead, trading blow for blow. The enemy's shields flickered but held. Then the vultures made their move, dropping a boarding pod that slammed into the iron wind's hull. With a shudder, Lyra unstrapped from the turret and grabbed her rifle, racing toward the breach. The corridors echoed with the clash of metal boots and blaster fire. As black armored figures poured inside, the crew met them in a furious hand-to-hand fight. Lyra moved through the chaos like water, ducking under swings, driving her rifle but into faces and pulling the trigger at point-blank range. Her mind empty except for the rhythm of movement and the weight of the gun in her hands. She reached the breach point where more vultures were forcing their way through. She hurled a grenade into the mass, and the blast tore them back. The air filled with smoke and sparks. In the haze, she saw a taller figure step forward, the same mass leader from the recording, his armor etched with crimson marks. He moved with the ease of a predator, circling her without a word, then striking fast. Lyra blocked the first blow, but the second slammed into her ribs. She staggered, but stayed on her feet. Firing at close range, the shots glanced off his armor, and he drove her back with relentless strikes. Their fight moved down the corridor, the walls shuddering with each blow. She ducked under his blade and caught him in the side with a shot that made him grunt. But he spun and caught her arm, twisting the rifle away. She dropped low, sweeping his legs. He stumbled, and she lunged forward, tackling him. They crashed to the floor, grappling for control, his hands closing around her throat, but she pushed back with all her strength, breaking his grip and slamming her forehead into his mask. The visor cracked, and she saw his eyes for the first time, cold and bright with hate. Before he could recover, she grabbed her fallen rifle and fired 3 quick bursts into the crack. The shots punched through. He went still, then slumped to the floor. The crew around her drove back the last of the boarders. Mara's voice came over the comm, telling them the command ship's shields were down, and now was the time to finish it. Lyra ran back to the gun deck, strapping in and locking onto the enemy vessel. Her shots ripped into its engines, flames spilling into the void. The iron wind's cannons followed with a final volley that split the ship apart in a blinding flash. Silence fell as the debris drifted away. The sensors showed no more enemy contacts. The vultures were gone. Mara walked onto the gun deck and looked at Lyra for a long moment before saying it was over. Lyra nodded, but she knew it was not truly over, not in the way Mara meant, because she had crossed a line in the fight with the leader. She had felt something she could not name, a fire that burned cold and clear, and she knew she would never be the same. When they returned to the safe lanes, word of the battle had already spread. Traders spoke of the iron wind destroying the ash vultures, and of a human girl who led the counterattack. The whispers grew into a legend. Some said she was not just a mercenary, but a weapon forged by war. Others claimed she was a ghost who could not be killed. Lyra paid no mind to the stories. She sat in the mess hall, cleaning her rifle, thinking of the stars beyond the next job, beyond the next fight. Mara came to her with a new contract, one that would take them far from the core into places where few humans had gone before. Lyra agreed without hesitation because she knew the hunt was never truly done. There would always be another enemy, another battle, and she would be ready. The girl who had once been an orphan had become something else entirely, something the galaxy would remember and fear.